we're going to talk about attention. And it's probably one of the most important things we talk about. Because lots of people think that they can pay attention to lots of things all at the same time with no decrease in performance. And sometimes they do this at 65 or 70 miles an hour. And that decision to do that, to do those two things, their competence that they are paying attention to everything that's relevant, that they are perceiving everything in their environment that they need to attend to, is totally wrong. Totally wrong. And if by the end of today I convince even one of you to never text again, or if you're in the car with somebody who's texting while they're driving, you are willing to say, you know, put your phone away, man. That's totally not safe. Just like you would take the keys out of the hand of a drunk person, because it's just as dangerous. And the worst part is people think, oh, I can do it. I've done it before. Everything was fine. Only takes once. If I can convince one of you to not do it, it'll be worth my standing up here and invoking the power of my father, the Baptist preacher. Because he was a Baptist minister before he went to college. And because it's so quick, it's so easy, and it seems like I'll just type OMW, and it'll be fine. And Reggie, that's what he was texting. And he drifted across the center line and caused another man to murder 2 people with his car. And I would rather have your friend not know your OMW than you be dead or someone else be dead. Because you're awesome and a lot of people love you. And the people that you could kill have people who love them. Okay, now that we've started that off on a positive note, you like my shirt? It's my attention shirt. So make sure you pay attention today. Because if you don't pay attention on the lecture about attention, something is fundamentally wrong. Okay. So when we talked early on about attention, I mentioned a task that is commonly used to study attention. It's one of the early tasks that were developed for exploring this cognitive process when it became okay again in the 50s and 60s to study cognition and study the mind, even though it's not something we can actually see. And this lecture I'm going to do by focusing mostly on the different experimental tasks that are used. Because attention is not something we can see. We all know it's there. We all know when we're attending to different things, usually. But it's not a thing we can see or measure in really obvious ways necessarily. But researchers have come up with some really cool ways to explore the dimensions of our ability to attend. And attention is critical because attention is what allows us to ignore information in the environment that is not important. And when we attend to something, we basically turn off other things in our environment. Because we have limited resources to process information from the world. And I know you feel like you're kind of, at some level, paying attention to everything, but you're not. There are things going on in this room right now that you are not aware of. And you won't know you're not aware of them. And so you think they're not there. But we're going to focus on a bunch of different tasks and the types of attention they tell us about. Dichotic listening task involves putting headphones on participants and playing different messages into each ear, or different kinds of signals, and asking the participant to attend, or just pay attention to, the information coming in one ear or the other. And what we're examining when we use a dichotic listening task is one of the most basic functions of attention, which is to select some subset of the information that is coming into us from the world and focus on it at the cost of everything else. And we call this selective attention, okay? The ability to selectively attend to things in the world. Now, sometimes we have participants demonstrate that they are selectively attending by having them engage in a secondary task that requires them to either repeat what they're hearing or to remember what they're hearing and answer questions about it later. So we invoke higher level cognitive processes that require them to do something with a particular piece of information. And once you start asking people to do something with a particular piece of information, then they'll focus on it more. So shadowing is a task where we ask the participants to just repeat as they hear what's coming in. Okay, so in this case, we have a participant who is hearing on this side a story: the yellow dog chased a ball across the road and ran into the field, something. And over here, you've got another voice saying something completely different. The meaning of life is to love others and be wonderful and eat cookies or something. Okay, so you're listening to those things. But the participant is clearly attending only to what's happening over here because he's shadowing that piece of information. And by doing that, he's reducing all this information coming in to a manageable level so he can focus on it, he can think about what he needs to do, he can simply repeat what's going on, and to do that, he's got to figure out what words are being said, he's got to find how to pronounce those words himself, he's got to string them together. And he needs to be able to do that quickly because the story keeps continuing in this ear, and he's got to get that information out in time to say the next thing that's coming. If he sits there and tries to think about it too long, he's going to forget what was said because his memory for stuff that's coming in his ear isn't very long. He's got to get it out in a fraction of a second because more information is coming in really fast. Now, when we have people do a dichotic listening task, we find that they can do these shadowing tasks, they can tell us all kinds of things about the message they were attending to. But what they can't do is tell us about what was happening in their other ear. I mean, they know there was a message. They can usually tell us the gender of the speaker, male or female. Sometimes the gender of the speaker will change and they don't notice if it's in the unattended ear. Sometimes the language the other person is speaking will change and they don't notice. The caveat here, or the caveats I should say, are that even though they're not paying attention to what's coming in that other ear, stuff does leak through. So they're not consciously focusing on what's happening over there, but at some level, they must be monitoring at a very, very low level of attention. Or something is just leaking through that attentional filter. They're not actually monitoring at any level, but the filter is not perfect. And that filter allows through things like some things that are surprising or personally important to the speaker. Sometimes the change in gender is noticed. Sometimes, not always. Depends. Okay. Sometimes, if it changes from a speaker, someone talking, to some different kind of signal, like a musical tone or something like that, then their attention will be grabbed back. Like, what just happened in the other ear? They might not be able to tell you what happened, but at some level they know something changed. And cocktail party effect, remember we talked about this before? It's that important information, personally important information, particularly the participant's name, gets through pretty much at 100%. So, and if, other things are super personally important, so if maybe they're listening for a particular, or they came to a party looking for a particular person, and they've been looking and looking for that person, and they haven't found them, as soon as they hear that person's voice, they'll orient, even if they didn't know the person had come in. Or, as I said, when I was living in Japan, and I was living in a community where basically nobody spoke English, if I went to a party or something and somebody started speaking English because somebody said, oh, Kim's going to be there, we should bring this other foreigner that we know, because they probably know each other, right? Because, all non-Japanese people are friends. Then, then someone would come in the door and someone would speak to them in English, and then I would hear an actual native English-speaking voice, and my brain would go, what? Even though I was over here focusing really hard on speaking Japanese while drinking lots of sake, which takes more work, a lot more work. But my Japanese is actually really good when I'm drunk. Okay, so, because you just relax and you don't care about making mistakes anymore. You're like, whatever. And everyone else is drunk, so they don't care for making mistakes either. All right. Now we can kick it up a notch to look at selective attention using something called a flanker compatibility task. Now a flanker compatibility task is also intended to look at selective attention, but the goal of this task is to look at the intersection between our ability to selectively attend to things and our current cognitive load. Now, cognitive load is this idea that we have a limited amount of cognitive resources. Everybody has a certain amount of mental work that they can do all at the same time. And if we are doing something that is really easy for us, then that doesn't require very many of our resources. If we are doing something that is hard for us, that takes more resources. And one of the reasons that we practice certain mental tasks is because the more we practice those tasks, the easier they get. Right? You ever notice that? Why do you think your parents wanted you to practice piano or go to practice for whichever team? And why do coaches have players do drills? Is because you want the person to not have to focus on all the details. You want the details to be natural. But in general, even if you're talking about something that's not super unusual, everybody has a certain cognitive load that they can bear at any given time. And we can impact the amount of load we're putting on the person's cognitive system and see how that relates to their ability to selectively attend to different pieces of information. So imagine that you're doing a task where you're going to look at strings of letters, 3 letters. Okay, we call these trigrams. Tri for 3, gram for letter. Okay, trigrams. You're looking at these trigrams, and you're told, all right, so you're going to see 3 letters in a row. And all we want you to do is look at the letter in the middle. Okay? You don't have to worry about the first letter or the third letter. Just look at the letter in the middle. Okay? That's all you got to do. That sounds like a pretty easy task, right? You could look at one letter without too much stress. And we tell them, if you see that the letter in the middle, we'll call that the target. Okay? If the target is the letter A or the letter B, we want you to hit this key. If the target is the letter C or the letter D, we want you to hit this key. Okay? 2 keys, does it all like a cogwheel experiment. Okay. Now, that's their instruction. So we've got the different kinds of targets we want them to look for. Left key targets and right key targets. And what we manipulate is the kinds of flankers that are in the stimuli. And you know what a flank is, right? The flank is the side, right? Flank steak comes from the side of a cow. I don't know why I know that. I'm a vegetarian. I haven't eaten meat in almost 30 years. But I'm from Colorado. I guess it's something you just learn. So flankers are things on the side. And we manipulate whether those flankers are type 1, that is A or B, or type 2, C or D. Compatible flankers are flankers that would elicit the exact same response as the target if they had been told to respond to them. So for example, say I have in all 3 of these cases, the target is A. Okay. If the stimulus trigram is BAB, this is a case of compatible flankers. Because if the target is A, they're supposed to push the left key. If the target is B, they're supposed to push the left key, right? So in this case, the flankers encourage the same response as the target. Does that make sense? That's compatible. We do this a lot. We'll make things compatible or incompatible, or congruent or incongruent, okay? Meaning they match or they don't match. And when things match, people are very fast to respond because, well, why? Why would it be easy for you to respond to the target when the flankers encourage the same response? Your hand's up here, so I'm picking you.
I think it makes it easy because you already know that if it's A or B, you're going to press this key. So when you see the B, even though that's not the target, when you see the A in the middle, you're going to go quicker because it doesn't confuse you.
There's no confusion, right? It doesn't give you any kind of conflicting message. Right? And remember, we've asked them not to pay any attention at all to those things on the side, right? So technically, if they can totally just ignore those things, this should have no impact at all, right? It shouldn't matter at all what we put on the sides. We should be able to put anything we want. We should be able to put somebody flipping them off, and it shouldn't matter, right? But we see when we have those letters on the side that would elicit the same response, there's no conflict, no confusion, and they're super fast. Okay? Very accurate, very fast. When we put flankers on the side that are not compatible, in other words, they suggest the other response. If those were the target, you should hit the other button. Then we get a conflict, right? And all we're talking about is pay attention to one letter, and people are still like seeing the other stuff, right? Because it's even though they're focusing their attention, that information is kind of leaking in a little bit because it's right there in their eyes. I mean, the letters are right next to each other. It's like that big of a thing. You could look at it. I mean, it's not like you can just, you might not respond to them, but that information that they're there is still leaking in because it's coming in your eyes. It's not like you can zoom in and like block out everything around it, right? And people are really slow. Well, I mean, statistically, slower, even though we've asked them not to pay any attention to those things. And in the case of neutral flankers, in other words, flankers for which the subjects have been given no instruction whatsoever, so they don't elicit any facilitation and they don't elicit any conflict, right? We see something in the middle to these two. So even when they see something that they've been given no specific instruction to respond to, it distracts them enough to get a significantly slower response. Not as slow as this one, but they're still a little bit slower. And this is still a pretty easy task. So imagine if people's ability to selectively attend can be influenced by letters on either side of a target, how easy is it to get distracted by other things, like looking at your phone to see if you got a Facebook message? And you think, I'm totally looking at the road because my eyes are right there. And I'm holding I've seen people doing this on the connector. Have you? Looking at their phone. They're holding it up by the windshield as if somehow holding it here will make it so that they can see what's happening in front. Oh, I'm good. And I've seen people reading books. Yeah, they've got their Kindle or their iPad on the steering wheel, and they're holding it like this while they drive. And I just want to go, what are you doing? Like, I think that is totally grounds for road rage. Like, what are you doing? And on the connector, you know they're going like 80. And I'm just thinking, what are you doing? And it's not just that, right? You see, I see women going down the connector. Doing their makeup. Doing their makeup. Brushing their hair. Or, I like the one where people do this.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get something off the seat, or they're reaching in the back, right? And they're like, I'm totally good, I'm watching the road, eyes on the road. We're going to find out by the end of this lecture why that really doesn't help that much. All right, so identifying a central target in a trigram is pretty easy. Okay, this is a low task. It doesn't make people don't have to work very hard to do it. But because they don't have, it's not very hard for them to do, it means that they have resources available to get distracted. Okay, does that make sense? It's not a very hard thing for them to do. So they have all these resources that are available to attend to other stuff. And while they're sitting there in the lab doing this task, the first thing that reaches in and grabs their remaining attention are those flankers. Okay? So when you're doing something that's pretty easy for you, it's easier for you to get distracted by other things. Now, how many of you have been driving a car for a long time?
Fine, long time.
Well, okay. How many of you started driving when you were 16? How many of you been driving for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, 20 years? Okay. Long time. Believe me, this is on my mind. My daughter gets her permit next Tuesday. All right. So, you've been doing this for a long time. Do you remember when you first started driving?
Yes.
Do you remember how it was hard to keep everything together? You had to think about turn signals and your speed and your lane and is your seatbelt on, is the door locked, is the radio off, you know? And it got harder when it, like, you had sometimes, even now, right? I've been driving for a long time. More than 30 years. And even now, if it's a really bad storm, I'll tell my daughter, be quiet, I'll turn off the radio, right? Why? Because even in if it's a really bad storm, really bad rain or ice or something like that, I need to concentrate. I don't want to be distracted. Even though driving is a really pretty easy thing for me to do, and usually I can do it with the radio on, you know, my daughter's in the car, she's talking to me about something else, I'm looking at the road, I'm thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner, you know, you can do about 27 other things. You can't do that when you first start driving, right? When you first start driving, driving itself takes up all of your cognitive resources. That's why they say you can't, you know, that's why they have laws that say, like, you can't have more than one person in the car when you first start to drive, right? You can't drive at night, you can't, you know, do all this other stuff, because it takes all of your resources, which means you don't have any resources for anything else out there. And while it's good because you're really focused on the driving task, the more and more you do this task, the easier it gets. So the longer you've been driving, the easier that task has gotten for you. You now how many of you drive with your phone on the seat next to you, and you might not text and you might not call, but if someone sends you a message, do you at a red light, she's like, okay. You got, how many of you listen to music or books while you're driving? How many of you talk to people in the car while you're driving? How many of you use your cell phone even hands-free while you're driving? Bluetooth. You're like, hands-free. Your hands don't have eyes. All right. So there's all these things that you could not do. How many of you have been in a car with like 4 or 5 other people and you're all talking, having a conversation? You see people driving down the road, they got a movie going in the back, 3 kids, they're talking to somebody, they're on their phone, they're, whatever. We can do a lot more things after we've been driving for a long time. But that's because we've made that driving stuff, shifting gears, changing lanes, using your turn signal. Oh, God, lots of people have just forgotten to do that. Well, yeah. That kind of stuff. Monitoring speed, although lots of people have just forgotten to do that completely too. We have more resources because we practice more. And so we have resources to do all these other tasks. But this task, easy, right? Lots of resources to get distracted. So we are distracted, even by things that have no reason to distract us at all. Now, if we make the task harder, okay, we go from I've been doing this task forever and it's super, super easy to something that takes a little bit more work. So here we've got the target X. Okay. And we can do this task. This is called a very low task, where we're going to do a low version of the task and a high version of the task. In other words, we're going to do a task that's really easy to do. So this is like the simple trigram condition that I just showed you. And then we can do a hard version of the task over here and see how they're different. And so the task here is to tell whether or not there is an X in the circle of letters. Okay? Now in this case it's easy. Why would it be easy to tell if there's an X in that circle of letters?
Because the other letters are the same.
Hmm?
The other letters are the same.
That's true. They are the same. That's one reason. Why else?
They don't have the same shape.
Their characteristics are quite different, right? X is a very angular character made with straight lines. O is a round character. Okay, it's very round. So remember that our perceptual system is based on features, right? And we analyze the world in terms of features. Features of, physical features like shapes, like sounds. We analyze the world that way. Yeah, sure.
Would that be something as like we were talking about the top down?
Mm-hmm.
Something that we automatically have a perception of it before?
Well,
Thinking about
we have biologically feature detectors that are designed to pick up features in the world. We then synthesize those features together to form objects. And our perception is our identification of those objects. So we can see things in the world and not know what they are, right? Not have a name for it, not know what it means, not know what it's for. And that's the sensation part. The top-down part is imparting our experience and saying, I know what that is, I know what that's called. That labeling, that recognition is the perception, the interpretation of the thing is our perception. The feature part that's kind of a built-in physical mechanism. I don't know if I would think of that as top-down knowledge, because knowledge I think of as something that I've acquired. And I didn't acquire my feature detectors, I was born with them. And then they were trained based on my environment. So what my feature detectors learned to be sensitive to because of my environment, I guess I can think of that as top-down knowledge. Yeah. I can think of that as top-down knowledge. What my feature detectors have learned to be sensitive to is top-down knowledge. I can live with that. And then how I have learned to interpret those things is also my top-down knowledge. But this task is easy because X's and O's stimulate totally different feature detectors. X's require that we look for features that are very straight and angular. O's require that we look for things that are round. So different feature detectors altogether, different physical mechanism. I mean, it's the same, they're all kind of in the same place, but different feature detectors, different neurons are responding to these kinds of letters. So as you might imagine, when you do this, if people have been asked to respond to this, we see that there is a certain response time to that task, right, to that low task, when there are compatible flankers, low load task. In the high load task, now why would this be high load? I'm looking for an X here.
There's a lot to process.
Hmm?
There's a lot to process. Like
Why?
the K looks like the X.
These are going to activate similar feature detectors, right? These also have straight and angular lines. So I have to work a little bit harder to tell, is it the right combination? In fact, if you want to think about it this way, this is a feature detection task, and we're talking about a single feature. This is a conjunctive task, right? Remember we talked last time about feature detecting and where we're talking about a single feature versus conjunctive search. This is just a feature search. This is a conjunctive search, and we know conjunctive searches are harder because you have to do more mental work to figure out if the specific combination of features is present. So this is a high-load task. And what's interesting is that even when the flanker is compatible, and this was the fastest response before, right? Fastest response. We see that people are less distracted by flankers when they're performing a hard cognitive task. So if you're driving in really bad weather, you're less likely to notice that your phone just went ding and you have a text message. You're also less likely to consider picking up your phone and texting because you just don't have the resources to manage it. It's when you think you're safe and comfortable and have lots of resources to spend that distraction becomes a temptation. It's when you think you're in the best situation to use those other resources. The problem is that distractions are distractions. And when we divide our attention, we do not divide it evenly. We can attend to different things in a little bit in parallel, talking about, kind of paying attention to one thing, paying attention to another thing, and trying to do two different things at the same time. Driving your car and listening to the radio. Or folding laundry and talking to your friend on the phone. Or watching a TV show and putting dishes away. You can do that. Two different tasks. You can divide some of your attention across each task. So we know people can do that. To explore the limits of that, researchers have come up with things like the mapping task. Now the mapping task involves having people engage in those kinds of searches, feature searches or conjunctive searches, right? Engage in those kinds of searches, while asking them to hold things in memory at the same time. So they have to keep something that they saw at the beginning in memory, and then do a whole bunch of those search tasks, and then they get a check to see whether or not they saw what they were trying to remember anywhere when they were doing the search, right? So you're asking them to remember stuff and search at the same time. We're dividing their attention across these two tasks, and we can manipulate how hard the stuff is that we want them to remember, and we can manipulate how hard it is to do the searches. And that way we can explore, now kind of kicking it up a notch, what happens when we pull people's attention apart on purpose, and how does their performance fare. So let me show you this particular task. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the easy version. Okay, this is as we keep making things more and more complicated, right? So first thing we do is we show people something to remember. Okay? Here's the thing we want you to remember. This 3. And we could show them one number, 2 numbers, 3 numbers, or 4 numbers. Okay, so here are the numbers that we want you to remember, but this would be the super easiest version. Okay? 1 number we want you to remember. Now we're going to show you a series of test frames. Okay? You're going to look at these frames, and you're going to look at them as fast as you possibly can. These are actually going to go by at about 20 milliseconds per frame. Okay, 20 milliseconds. Super, super fast. That means 5 frames for every 100 milliseconds. 10 100 milliseconds in a second. Right? So 50 of these frames are going to go by in a second. Now, you can perceive things that fast. But this is a hard... Now, well, I didn't say it was going to be super easy now, did I? Remember? I said it's going to be easy. I didn't say it's going to be super easy. Okay? So we're flipping these things by really fast. Even if I did it every 50 milliseconds, you'd still be talking, what? 20 frames per second. Really fast. And all of these things on the cells, these are the letters that you see on there, those are distractors. The target, the thing that they were asked to remember, is always a number. This is why this is called the consistent mapping task, because the target is always a number, and the distractors are always letters. So effectively, we've turned this into a kind of a... It's almost like a feature search, because you can focus in your mind on the number of things that count as numbers, right? What counts as a number? And you can partially block out things that count as letters, even though they might have so similar features, because numbers are a special category, and letters are a special category. Okay? But we present these really, really fast, and 20 of them. Boom, 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 boom. So 1 second. And they say, okay, did you see the target? Did you see it? Yes or no? And as you might imagine, people suck at this at the beginning because it's a little bit challenging, right? But what's interesting is that so in the beginning, right, when they have just done this a few times, they have to answer yes or no, right? And they're kind of performing it about chance. No, yes, whatever, they're kind of faking it. But they are actually taking in information, and over time, and of course you're talking about 1 trial every second. So we can get through 600 trials pretty quick, right? Because you're talking about being able to do 60 trials a minute. So after they've done this for 10 minutes, they actually improve. They get better at doing this. And remember, the number of things they're having to remember and look for can vary from 1 number to 4 numbers. But with practice, subjects get better at dividing their attention, remembering what it is they need to look for, and paying attention to what's coming across the screen, and remembering what they have to look for, and being able to remember whether or not they saw it in that particular set of trials. And after they've done this for about 900 trials, so about 15 minutes, they're at 90% accurate. Okay, so they can get good at this consistent mapping task pretty quick. And it appears that after about 600 trials, where that arrow is, they were able to do this pretty automatically. In other words, they would just see it and do it, see it, do it, see it, do it, see it, do it. And they weren't even really thinking about what they were doing. They weren't concentrating as hard, they were relaxing, and they were just doing it. But they're getting better, right? So as they relaxed, as they got better at the task, this complex task requiring them to do these 2 things, as they relaxed and were able to practice the task more, they freed up cognitive resources, and eventually were able to do the task almost perfectly after 20 minutes, 30 minutes. They could do this no problem. So even when your attention is divided, if you're doing things that you've had a lot of practice with, you can do both of those things pretty well, but you have to practice. Right? And that's why in the beginning you're driving your car and you're really kind of focusing on the road, hands at 10 and 2, and make sure you're not going too fast. And then pretty soon, after you've managed to do those different things, like, okay, now I need to do my turn signal, and now I need to look, and now I need, right? You have to learn all those things. And now you can do all those things and have somebody in the car, and have the radio on, and you can, because you're good at it. Now, let's up the ante. Now we're going to make it hurt, because we're, psychologists, we're mean and evil. Okay, now we're going to do a varied mapping task. So here we have trial 1. Trial 1, we say, all right, here's your target. Your target's the letter P. Here are your distractors. Go. Okay, now we can also show them between 1 and 4 letters up here. And 4 letters are going by on every slide, and we're going through 20 slides, 50 slides per second. Boom. Okay, how good do you think people are at this?
Not good.
Why would they be so bad at it? What'd you say?
Both target and distractors are letters.
Both the targets and the distractors are letters, right? So they aren't able to do any kind of focused search for a particular category of things. They aren't able to say, let's just look for numbers. They have to actually look, because every one of these is also a letter. So the category of letters doesn't help them isolate anything. Right? So they have to go through and do this. But this is not why we could, you think, but that's not varied mapping. Those are actually the same. Why is that called varied mapping? It's called varied mapping for this reason. Because on the next trial, that's the target. And guess what it was last time? A distractor. So now things that were distractors can become targets because they're all part of the same category. So it's called varied mapping because a thing can be either a target or a distractor depending on the task, depending on the trial. Right? So in one trial, one thing could be a target. On the next trial, you're supposed to ignore it and pay attention to something that you were supposed to, pay attention to. So you're ignoring things one time, paying attention to them the next time, and that's changing every single trial, and trials are going by 1 per second. Right? Okay. That hurts. And we are good, we are amazing. Our brains are fantastic. And people are like, oh, no. That is hard. When we look at people who are doing consistent mapping, they were able to get to almost perfect performance. Even when if we put frames up for 100 milliseconds, we could get them to perfect performance really quick. Where each frame we're showing 10 frames per second, we can get them almost to perfect performance instantly. Just a few minutes. Okay? But people who were doing this very task, even if we slowed it down to 5 frames per second, 3 frames per second, 2 frames per second. Oh, about then. We got them to 2 frames per second. They could get to where they could do this task at about 90% accuracy after practicing it and practicing it and practicing it for a really long time, sometimes even multiple sessions of practice. So this was hard. So when they said to slow down this task 500% to get people good enough to divide their attention and learn to do the tasks automatically. So hard tasks are very difficult for us to automate. When we are being pushed really hard, it's difficult for us to automate. So the big message here is that our ability to divide our attention successfully with minimal penalties, okay, our ability to do that and be able to learn and relax, because they could never free up enough cognitive resources to learn how to do it well when it was going by too fast. It was just too hard. Okay? So, in order to divide our attention successfully across multiple tasks without losing as much speed and accuracy, a bad amount of speed and accuracy, we have to be doing something we have to be doing tasks that aren't too hard. We are not good at doing multiple hard tasks. And if we're doing multiple hard tasks, we can almost never learn enough while we're doing it to get it to where it's automatic. It's just too hard. And this is referred to as the load theory of attention. And it's pretty common, this idea that we, in order to learn, in order to be able to attend to stuff, in order to be able to learn new abilities, you have to have cognitive resources to dedicate, to attend to learning those things. This is the load theory of attention. This idea that if we're using a low amount of our cognitive resources, then we have other resources available to attend to other stuff. If we're using all of our cognitive resources, if we're doing something that's hard for us, then we don't have any resources to dedicate to other stuff. And that's important for learning. I'm just adding this on. This is important for learning because in order to learn stuff, you need to be able to make connections with the stuff you're thinking about with stuff you already know. And if you're working way too hard, you don't have any resources to make those connections, right? You have to be comfortable and using only part of your resources so that you have remaining cognitive resources to do something else, like make connections and learn it. Remember it. Weave it in with other things. Come up with examples. If you're doing it, and we've all been in classes like this, right? We're just paying attention to what you're doing in the class. You're just like, I can't remember anything this person talks about because I'm trying so hard to keep up with everything they're putting up on the screen. I can't write it all down fast enough. I don't even understand what they're saying. You know, you had that experience, right? You've been in a class like that? And it's frustrating because you feel like you're working so hard and you're not getting out of it what you feel like you're putting into it. And that's because you don't have any resources left to do the other cognitive tasks you need. You're focusing so hard on trying to take in what that person is doing, you can't think about the other things you need to think about to make connections. Does that make sense? So here, yes, you can get distracted, but it also means you have cognitive resources left to do other things. Here, you can't get distracted, but you also can't do anything else because you're just focusing. And sometimes that's what you need to do, right? Sometimes there isn't anything else, right? Sometimes that's the one thing you need to be doing right at that moment. Like you're driving a car with your most precious cargo in the whole world, like your kid, right? In the car with you, and it's a big storm, and people around you are driving like idiots, and you're trying not to die. And there's nothing else you need to think about but getting that car to somewhere safe, and that's it. And that's fine. You don't have to worry about learning. You have to work on not dying. That's fine. But most of the time, we'd like to be in a place where we're using some of our resources, but not all of them, so that we can respond to other things if necessary. All right. Now, we usually divide our attention well across lots of tasks, but we are best at doing what are called automatic tasks, not controlled tasks. Let me distinguish now between automatic and controlled tasks. Automatic tasks are tasks that we have engaged in so many times that we can perform them on autopilot, basically. Like when you drive now, You're pretty much on autopilot. You get in your car, and you can drive it without thinking about all the things you had to think about when you first started learning how to drive. And it changes a little bit when you get into a car you don't know very well. You have to think about it a little bit more, because maybe if you know, any of you drive a manual transmission? I do. A lot of people don't. If I make you get into a manual transmission car, all you automatic car drivers, they say that the absolute best security system for a car in Atlanta is a stick shift. Because the people who steal cars don't know how to drive them, so they'll just leave them. They're like, I don't know how to drive them. And I have a stick shift that I park at the bottom of my driveway. My driveway goes like this. So if somebody wanted to steal my car, they'd have to put it in reverse and back it straight up out of a driveway and not hit the fences. Good luck. If you don't know how to drive a stick shift. You're going to stall that thing out 50 times, I'll be able to call before you ever get up the driveway. All right, so when you first learn, if you're not used to driving a manual transmission car, when you get in it, you're going to have to focus on the clutch and the stick shift and listening to the engine and knowing when it's, revving enough to change gears and things like that. That's going to be a controlled task for you because you don't know how to do it very well. You have to focus on it a lot. Okay. Controlled tasks are tasks you don't know how to do very well, so you have to focus all your attention on what you're doing. But the other parts of driving, things like turn signal and changing lanes and monitoring speed, you know how to do all those things. You don't pay very much attention to that kind of stuff because you've done it so many times now, it's easy. And we automate all kinds of things. One of my favorite examples of automation, and this is kind of a girl one. Okay. I don't know if girls still do this, but back in the day, long time ago, when girls liked a boy in elementary school, they would write their married name on their folder, right? So I really liked, when I was in 4th grade, I really liked a boy named Scott Browning. So I practiced writing my name, because of course I was going to marry Scott Browning. I was going to marry Scott Browning, and so I practiced Kim Browning. Kim Darnell Browning. I practiced and practiced until I picked out a signature that I loved, right? And girls used to do this all the time. And apparently this is a behavior that you continue to do when you are actually going to get married. So when I was going to get married to a guy named Jim Ainsworth, and we had decided, at his suggestion, I was like, I'll just keep my name, you keep your name, because by that time I'm like, take your name, why? And then he said, I have an idea. I'm a forward-thinking modern guy. Let's take each other's names. Let's hyphenate our last name. We'll both be Ainsworth Darnell, because he wanted to stay in A because he liked being first. And I said, okay, we won't do Darnell Ainsworth. We'll do Ainsworth Darnell. That sounds nice. We'll be Kim and Jim Ainsworth Darnell. Won't that be cute? Oh, it'd be adorable. So of course I had to practice because I was really good at writing Darnell. But I hadn't written Ainsworth. I had to practice so that it would look good because you want it to look good. So I was like, okay, Ainsworth. And I practiced until I had this cool star-looking A, and it was looking awesome. And then we get married, and we walk back, and we have to sign the marriage certificate, and I'm ready, because now for the first time, I am signing my new fancy signature. So excited. And I know it's super girly of me, you wouldn't expect it, but I was really excited. And I sign it, and of course they let me do it first, because ladies first. Like I'm the lady, I should have known. Anyway, so I do it first, and then they hand it to my husband. And he does this. Two L's, right? He didn't even know how many L's were in my name. I should have known. I had practiced writing his name so that it would look good with my name. And he wasn't even sure if there were two L's in my name. I know, to, right? Because he'd written Jim Ainsworth over and over and over his whole life. And then he does this. And he gets there and then he goes, 2 L's, right? And I'm just like, oh, I should have known. But he had clearly automated this part. That part was still controlled, which may be why he thought I was very controlling. But it's not really the case. Anyway. Because I expected him to know how many L's were in my name when we got married. So I would just make sure, before you get married, the person that you're marrying knows how to spell your name. Especially if they're taking it. It's a really handy thing. So, that's the difference between automated control processing. Me signing my married name, automated processing. Him signing his married name, control processing. Because he did it. He wasn't just doing it. He had to think about it. He even had to ask. Okay, so we're driving only. Okay? Our chance of missing a signal, a driving signal, okay, about 3%. Just in general principle. Just driving, you're going to miss a particular signal, fail to respond to a particular signal properly, about 3% of the time. Okay. Now that's scary because how many of you think you miss 3% of the signals around you? Probably not. You probably think that you stop at all the right times and yield at all the right places. Odds are you're missing about 3% of them. Okay? If you turn on the radio, this isn't even somebody else in the car. This is just having the radio on. It goes up to 4%. Now, how many of you drive with the radio on? Yeah, so no, odds are about 4% of the time. Now, you're thinking, I don't really do that. I'm really good about stopping. I've never gotten a ticket, anything. Okay, so here's the scary part. That means that there are enough other people doing it more often to make up for you. And that's why on almost every intersection in I like, when the light turns green, I wait a second. Because people are just like, people are always trying to just get through the last minute. And they're just like, la, 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 talking on the phone, whatever. And they're going 60 miles an hour, whatever. They don't care. But as soon as you start talking on your cell phone, and this is true whether it's hands-free or not, just so you know, hands-free or not, it goes up to 7%. So it's more than twice your risk for to fail to respond properly to traffic signal if you're talking on your cell phone. And it's different than talking to somebody else in the car. Talking on your cell phone, when you do that, you start attending in your head to that conversation, and you're looking at the road, but in your head you're attending to the conversation, and it actually pulls attention away from what your eyes are looking at. And when you're talking on the phone, the person that you're talking to isn't in the car experiencing the stimuli that you're experiencing. Have you ever been in the car and you're driving along and your passenger will say, whoa, 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 red light, and you didn't realize that the light was red? Right? Sometimes other people in the car, I mean, some people are backseat drivers and you want to smack them. But sometimes other people in the car, they're able to attend to stuff you're not able to attend to. And so they can actually be helpful under some circumstances. But when you're talking to somebody on your cell phone, that person can't see what you're doing. They can't see what's happening in your environment. And, you know, all the time, I'll be talking to people. I have a friend who calls me all the time, and when he's driving home from work. He's like, yeah, you want to go out? I'm driving home. I was thinking, let's go to the Highlander. All you can eat crab legs tonight. I'm just like, okay, heavy metal, lots of beer, crab legs. Let's go. Tuesday night. Okay. But he's talking to me on the phone, and then somebody will go, oh, wait, hold on a second, I can't talk right now, traffic. And even then, right, I mean, he realizes that if there's like an accident or something going on, he needs to not talk to me on the phone, because just having that conversation increases his risk for having an accident. And it does. Talking on the phone doubles your basic risk to not be able to respond in a traffic situation. And this is research that was done by the same guy that was shown in that Utah video clip, the researcher. And they've then gone on to study things like texting and other stuff like that. And your risk really goes up. And you feel like you've got cognitive resources to spare. but what's happening is it may actually be using more resources than you realize. And as a result, you don't have resources to be sensitive to pull back if something in the other part of your environment changes.
You know what the results came out for texting, the percentage?
I'd have to go find the new stuff that he's done. Which brings me to the concept of inattention blindness. Inattention blindness occurs when we selectively attend to one thing. Okay, so we focus our attention on one task, and as a result, we are unable to notice obvious non-target stimuli. And it can be the non-target stimuli. You would think, I mean, knowing that in a flanker compatibility task, seeing X's on either side of an A can actually distract you a little bit. You would think that you would be able to focus your attention on something, and something really obvious would not sneak by. For example, you would think that if you had people look at a crosshair on a computer screen, and their task was to indicate, pushing a left key or a right key, whether the vertical arm or the horizontal arm was the longer one. And you had them do this over and over and over. You had them doing it pretty quickly. And at some point while they were doing this, a shape appeared on the screen. And then they would do it a little bit more, and then they're asked, what object appeared on the screen while you were doing this task? You would think people would be able to tell you, right? Because it's not like this is super hard. And yet, you know what happens? You know what people say?
There's the shape.
They say, what shape? What object? What are you talking about? We have the ability to selectively attend so selectively that we can actually become blind to other things in our environment. We literally do not see things in our environment because we have, I mean, doing this task is not that hard. So it's not all about cognitive load. It's not all about that. We can focus our attention so intently that we literally become blind to things that are right in front of us. You ever met anybody who had a car accident and said, I don't know where that other car came from. It was just like out of nowhere. They were just there. And it literally, to that person, I mean, reading insurance reports is hysterical. Because they're like, I don't know where the tree came from. Just all of a sudden, it was in front of my car. And I'm like, I'm really sure that tree did not get up and walk into the road. You know, your car was on somebody's lawn. It's not like the tree reached out and grabbed you and pulled you into it. But there's like, all of a sudden, I'm running into a tree. And they're not drunk or anything. They just, I mean, they're like, I wasn't texting, I wasn't on the phone. You're like, yeah, right, sure you were.
Well, I wasn't.
Huh? But you weren't?
I wasn't, I just couldn't see it at the time.
You couldn't, I just couldn't see. That's how, I don't know what happened. But here's the thing. You're absolutely right. You didn't see it. You literally did not perceive. You did not take in the information. And this is what we call inattention blindness. And when you come back from the break, we're going to go on break now. Come back from a break at 12:25. I will show you something you will not believe people missed in an inattentional blindness task. I'll see you in 15 minutes. Stop moving. You know what happens? The detectors get overloaded and the world goes blank. So your eyes are, in fact, constantly moving. If you literally hold your gaze and don't move it even the slightest bit, the detectors start to get overloaded. They need time to refresh. And so our eyes constantly move. So even as you're sitting there, and I'm up here teaching, I'm looking at different students, you're looking at me, you're looking at your desk, you're looking at the screen, everything, I'm looking at my pen, I'm looking at what's on the desk. I'm constantly moving around, constantly moving my gaze around so that I can continue to take in information in the room. The only people I can really see, though, are the ones I'm looking at. Like, I can see you right now, and there's peripheral stuff happening over here, but I can't see that in the same detail. I know she just nodded, I know she's just looking over here, but I don't know a lot else about it. I'm not sure whether she's wearing glasses right now. Yes, she is, now I know. Okay? Could have been. I thought that might be the case, but I wasn't totally sure because I wasn't looking right at her. The way our eyes are designed, we take in much more detailed information when we're looking right at something. We take in less information around the periphery, and that's why when you want to really know what's going on, be able to take in more detail, you look at something directly. And that's overt attention. So if your friend tells you to look for something, and she says look left, and you look towards the other left, right? Then, the fact that you changed where you were looking from looking at her is an example of saccade, yes. But it's not necessarily connected to the fact that you looked at the other left. But fixation is when you stop your eyes, and that's when you actually take in information. And we find that when we put eye trackers on people and have them look around scenes, that we can actually find particular characteristics of scenes that guide where they look. Okay? And what we're looking for is what makes different stimuli more salient, or what makes different stimuli stand out, what makes them more important to the viewer, so that the viewer is more likely to fixate on them. Because when you have people look at different scenes, they tend to fixate on particular stuff. For example, when we look at how people look at faces, put an eye tracker on someone and have them look at another human face, what do you think they look at? Eyes, mouth, eyes, mouth, eyes, mouth. Why? Because you need to know, what's the person looking at? Are they looking at me? I'm talking to them. Are they looking at me? And remember, we also use information about what their mouth is doing, because that can convey emotion information as well as important language information to help us understand what they're saying. So when we look at people looking at people's faces, it's insane. They're going back and forth at their eyes, and they're going down and looking at their mouth like this. So it's like this weird triangle around their face. What's really interesting, though, is that when they do that same eye tracking thing on people who are far over on the autism spectrum, people have really intense autism symptoms, they don't look at people's faces. They're looking all around. They're not connecting to those things that people who are not on the spectrum focus on when it comes to people's faces. And they don't look at the same parts of scenes that people who are not on the spectrum look at. They're not tuning into those, the same things aren't salient to them, which is in part why they don't respond to them the way people who are off the spectrum do. So there are things like color and motion that we respond to, certainly. There are also, we have learned through experience that, things that are brighter get attention, things that are moving get attention, things that are, we'll check scenes out to see that they have the things we expect. So if you go to a baseball stadium, you will look in the dugout, you look at the field, your eyes will run the bases, you'll try to figure out, you'll look around at the scoreboard, right? So these are things that you expect to see in that scene. People will come into a scene and immediately their eyes, doesn't matter who we bring in, they check for the things they expect to see. And what they're doing is evaluating the scene using a schema. So they have an idea about what should go in that place, and they look for those things to kind of orient themselves in the space and know where the important stuff is, and what's important depends on where you are, right? So in a kitchen, first thing people come in and look for is where's the fridge, where's the stove, you know, and where's the sink? And then they might look for other things. But that people are really consistent about kind of orienting themselves. You walk into a bathroom, you want to know where's the toilet, and then where's the sink, and where's the bathtub. So people orient themselves that way. One of the reasons that you have a question or you're stretching?
Oh.
See, you grabbed my attention with motion. That's stimulus salience, which is why every time people go, I go, you need something? I'm like, no, I'm just stretching. I'm like, motion, you're capturing my gaze by moving. All right, so we use this knowledge of what should be in a scene, that's based on our expectation, to guide our fixations. And when we don't fixate on something, we don't see it. So very often in a scene where we have a very strong schema, we miss things we don't expect. If you don't know what to look for, then you don't look for it. Make sense? When you're in a scene where you don't have a schema, you're more likely to zip around and look at things that are moving and things that are colorful. So if you're in a bazaar in a country where you've never been before and there's people are selling stuff you've never seen and you don't really have any expectation for what should be happening here, you're going to be drawn to the things that grab your attention by being extremely salient. Are they pretty? Are they shiny? Are they colorful? Are they moving? Do they smell good? You know, stuff like that. The things that pull your attention are just going to be the things that pop out of the background, that are pulling at your resources more because of their salience. Now, overt attention is just part of the story, though. And I've been alluding to this a little bit already. But there's another kind of attention called covert attention. Covert attention is the attention we use for things we're not looking at. How many of you guys like to watch basketball? You know what a no-look pass is, right? What's a no-look pass? What's a no-look pass?
Looking in the opposite direction.
So you're looking over here, but you're monitoring where your teammate is over here, and you pass the ball to the person you're not looking at, right? Because we have a predisposition to think that people are paying attention to what they're looking at. But you don't have to do that, right? You can pay attention to what's going on back here, over here, right? You can pay attention. If you're walking down the street at night by yourself, even not by yourself, but if you're in an area where you think it could potentially be dangerous for any reason, you know, yeah, you're watching where you are really carefully, but you're also listening behind you, right? You're listening around you, so you're dedicating part of your attentional resources to things you can't see. You know you can't see them. When you're in your car, driving, right, and you realize something you want is in the back seat, and you can't really stop, what do? You're sitting in the car. Reaching back here, right? So you're looking this way, right? Giving yourself the illusion that you're paying attention to what's happening on the road. But your attention is actually back here, visualizing what's on the back seat and trying to find that thing like the pack of Oreos or whatever it was that you just decided you can't live for 3 more seconds without. You know, whatever the thing, whatever the thing is. People do this all the time. So we know that we don't have to look at something. We can certainly covertly attend to stuff. And we actually did a call out about this, where people had to look at a screen, they had to fixate at something on a screen, and then they would get a cue telling them which way something was going to show up, right? And you were supposed to hold your eyes on the screen, not move your eyes, right? So keep your over attention fixed. Don't move your eyes around. Don't look for the target, but you're going to get a cue that's going to give you a hint about where the target might show up on the periphery of the screen. So even though you're not overtly attending to the outside of the screen, you're focusing there on the middle, you should be faster if you're able to shift your covert attention to that place. And what we pretty typically find, if we have this happen, is that in the situation where people are fixating, we call these valid trials, okay, they're fixating here, and a cue says, you're going to get a target over there. And then the target shows up where you were cued. People are quite fast. Okay? Reaction times are very quick, on average under 250 milliseconds. So remember, just our simple reaction time is around 300 milliseconds. So here when you've got a cue where something's going to show up, you're even faster, right? Because you can almost anticipate to some degree where that thing is going to be. In invalid trials, subjects are given a hint about where to look. So they look here. They're told, look over here, you're going to, the thing's going to come over here. So kind of shift your attention, not your eyes, but your attention over here. And then it actually shows up in the wrong place. So that's called an invalid cue. So basically, you were told to shift your attention, your covert attention to the wrong place. And we see response times that are significantly longer, now up to 300 milliseconds. And this is consistent with the data for our class. We saw that students in the class who did the COG lab on spatial cueing were significantly faster to respond to targets that had valid cues than targets with invalid cues. So you guys demonstrated this, replicated this study, no problem. It also turns out that when we shift our attention to, we covertly shift our attention to something. We're not necessarily looking at it, but we're not just focusing on a particular place, but we can actually focus our attention, our covert attention, on whole objects. So, for example, say we had a display like this, and people are asked to focus on the center of the screen, and there's a cue like this that basically draws their attention to that end, the top end of the right bar. It turns out that when this target appears and they have to hit a button, they're significantly faster. We would expect it. They've been cued to focus on the top end of the bar. But what's interesting is that they're also significantly faster if the cue shows up down there. So because this is clearly a whole object, getting cued up here actually extends to the whole bar. So it's not just that up here is valuable, and that up here is better, but that the whole bar gets some kind of benefit from that cue. Even though this is a quite different part of the screen, they still get some generalizing benefit to the whole object. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some theories of attention. The most basic theory of attention, and one that we've already touched on, the very first flow model, information processing model, nice simple flow model, was Broadbent's filter model for attention. And his model said that messages from the world, sensory messages, come in to our sensory memory, which holds that information for a fraction of a second. We'll talk a little bit more about sensory memory when we get to the unit on memory. But sensory memory, we have different sensory memory for every sense. So I have visual sensory memory, auditory sensory memory, taste sensory memory, touch sensory memory. And that sensory memory has a very, very short duration, just a fraction of a second. Because new information is going to come in, and I need to be able to take in that new information. Sometimes information lingers a little bit. You ever taken a flash picture at night where it's really, really dark, and the image of the flash lingers in your vision? Okay? That's your visual sensory memory. Holding the image of the flash just for a second, because it was such an overwhelming stimulus. It was such contrast to what was around it that it holds it as if it were extra important for a second. Okay. So information comes in, and it goes to the filter. And the filter then sorts the stuff that's coming in terms of, it sorts the stuff that's coming in, and it says, okay, so you want to pay attention to this person's voice. You're talking to this person. Of all the signals that are coming around in this room right now, you're particularly interested in my voice. So you're going to attend to that. You're also interested in what's up here on the screen. So you're going to filter out other stuff, and you're going to let that message that you want to attend to, your selective choice, you're going to let that get to the detector, and that detector is then going to analyze the message for more stuff, more detail. And you're going to analyze it using your other cognitive resources, maybe decide what words I'm saying, decide what words are on the screen, stuff like that. You detected that particular message. Everything else is blocked out. And if the message is useful, you decide that it's good stuff, that it's something that's important, you may then try and store that message in memory for later use. Now, this model didn't explain the cocktail party effect very well because it couldn't explain why special information got through. It doesn't have any mechanism for letting in any information other than what you on purpose intend to let through. And yet we know that that happens. So this model, even though it was a nice early model, and it worked until we started doing a lot of the research we talked about today, has been modified, and the other models we're going to talk about are in part based on this idea, but on improvements of this particular model. Another thing this model can't explain is something called the Dear Aunt Jane effect. And this is where people in the dichotic listening task are able to, you're listening to a story in one ear by one speaker, and then all of a sudden that story is shifted over to the other ear that they weren't paying attention to, and you can even go back and forth, right? But the coherent message is jumping ears, and people are actually able to follow the message, so they're able to shift their attention back and forth even though they don't know that's what's going to happen. So something about their ability to selectively attend doesn't appear to be totally in their control. Sometimes their attention gets pulled away and they are selectively attending to something that they originally were trying to ignore. And then they suddenly realize, no, I need to pay attention over here. Wait, now I need to pay attention over here in order to get a coherent message. So their top-down processing says, if I just keep paying attention over here, I'm getting garbage. But if I jump back and forth, I'm getting some coherent story. And it's easier to process a coherent story, so I'm going to jump back and forth. And this model can't explain either of those phenomena. So other models have come forward, have been put forward to try and explain a little bit better some of these events. That's why we revise models, because we have new data we have to address. Treisman's model, called the attenuation model, says that information comes in to sensory memory and stuff, and then there's a thing called the attenuator. I love that. Sounds like a superhero. It's the attenuator, right? So we've got the attenuator. What the attenuator does is it says, all right, well, what is it that you want to pay attention to? You want to pay attention to Dr. Darnell's voice? Because she's probably saying stuff that's going to be on the test. So you're basically going to amplify that message. You're going to focus your attention on that. You're going to attenuate the message. Say, this is the important one. Pay attention to this. This is the one. And other stuff is coming through, but it's getting through only a tiny, tiny bit. You're kind of letting stuff filter in. And there are things that you know about what could be important and what's not important, right? You're pretty sure the sound of the projector is not very important. It's there, but you're not really paying attention to it. So those are unintended messages. They're still sneaking in, but then information comes in and it comes to something called the dictionary unit. So now all of a sudden language has gotten thrown into this model of attention. Language is really pretty important. We seem to organize a lot of our cognitive behavior around language. And Treatment says, yeah, I think language is so important that we actually have a unit in our attention that she referred to as the dictionary unit. And she says, in this unit, we have settings for language information so that our own name has a really low threshold for activation. Our native language, really low threshold for activation. Our child's voice going, Mom, or their baby's cry, really low threshold for activation. Because we basically said, if this ever pops up, I just want a default setting that says always respond to this, because it's important. Okay? And then there's other things that we've got settings for that can be kind of moderately important, or not important at all. And as an example, she said, so imagine that your own name has a super, super low threshold, so it doesn't take very much. As soon as somebody says your name, you hear it, even though you're not attending. Even though it's in this unattended message, you will still get it because the threshold for it is so low. But for a word, and I don't know why they picked this word, but I guess I get it. A word like rutabaga. How often do you hear the word rutabaga? Not very often. It's not a very important word for most people. So if somebody next to you goes, rutabaga, you're probably not going to notice it unless you're paying attention to that particular word for some reason, like you're really into rutabaga or something. But you have to admit, saying the word rutabaga is pretty fun. It's a great word. Then you have words like boat. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of middle, but chances are, if it's in an unattended message, you're not going to notice it, right? So there's stuff you're just not going to notice because it's not very important. And we have the ability to, and some stuff that you're just never going to notice. You're just never going to hear somebody say that. And if somebody around you is speaking a language you don't know, all of those things you don't even have units for those things. You're never going to know what's going on. You don't know what to attend to, so you have no way to set any threshold for anything they're saying. So this is what the dictionary unit is doing. It's setting thresholds. It's your kind of it's your presets, right, for how you want to respond in situations where you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you kind of always want to respond to a certain subset of things. And you preset those at a low threshold. And then other things, you're like, whatever, just set them according to the frequency with which I normally encounter them, and that'll be fine. And once things have gotten through that level of top-down filtering, right, based on the things you value and your previous experience, then that stuff gets shipped over to memory, if you decide that it's important. Then there's another approach that says, well, but sometimes even stuff that we don't have a preset for sneaks in. And we want to, how do we deal with that? And maybe we actually choose really, really late. Maybe we actually take in a lot more information than we think. And it's after we've taken in lots of information that we actually filter stuff out, and we just don't realize we've taken in as much information as we have. And this late selection approach was put forward by a guy called McKay. McKay did this really interesting dichotic listening task, where he had people listen to ambiguous sentences, like, they threw a rock at the bank, or They threw stones at the bank. They threw stones at the bank. And here's the thing, is that the word bank is ambiguous. A bank can either be a place that you save money, or it can be the part along the side of a river, right? You have the river bank or a regular money bank. Okay? And he would have people listen in one ear to these sentences that had ambiguous words in them. And in the unattended ear, there would be a disambiguating word. So for example, someone in one condition would hear, they threw stones at the bank, and in the other ear, what they would hear would be money. Simultaneously. Now they're not listening to what's going on in this ear, so they typically don't even know anything's coming in that ear at all. People in another condition would hear that sentence, they threw stones at the bank, and in the other ear, they would hear the word river. So it's intentionally done in a way not to be distracting, not to leap out at them, not to draw their attention away from the sentences that they're listening to. And then they would ask the subjects. You would ask the subjects, which of the following sentences describes or is the same as a sentence that you heard during the experiment? They give them a list. And what they found was that the subjects who heard the word river in one ear, even though they were not attending to that ear, they didn't even know they had heard anything, were significantly more likely to choose this option over this option, which was they threw stones toward the side of the river yesterday. In other words, he had basically gotten them to interpret the ambiguous word a particular way, even though there was nothing in the sentence that gave them that cue. And the only way this would be true is if at some level, even though they were not attending or expecting or preset to hear the word bank or river, they were still taking in that information and using it to make decisions about what the sentence meant during the experiment. And they had no way to know at the end of the study that they were going to be they were told they were going to be asked to recall sentences that they heard. And yet, what people recalled was quite consistently a match with the way they had been led to interpret the sentence. So, even though they didn't know the biasing words were there, so they couldn't have set a preset for them, they were still influenced by those words. So McKay argued that, in fact, we're taking in a lot more information than we know, and it's influencing how we interpret the world before we are even aware that the information has come into us. And so we don't, at this point, even know it may well be that we fluctuate, that we aren't doing our attentional processes the same every time, that there are some situations where we are particularly careful, and because we're selectively attending so hard that we only let certain pieces of information in. And there may be other cases where we take in, we're taking in information we don't even realize we're taking in because we're not, consciously attending to it at all, but we're still being influenced by that information. And it's stuff like this that makes people afraid of things like subliminal advertising, right? Because you don't even know that, every Coke ad says sex in it or whatever, right? You don't even realize it. You don't even know that that stuff is sneaking in, but it's influencing the way you feel about the ad. So, if we're doing this kind of late selection stuff, that's what makes people afraid of that, subtle information transmission that folks don't even know. One thing we do know, this was also put forward by Treisman, is that people seem to pay attention to things after they have taken in featural information. So we look at objects in the world. We can look at things that are moving. We can look at things that are stagnant. We take in objects We look at the world, and our visual system, or our auditory system, or our tactile system, takes it in terms of features, and that feature information is taken in pre-attentively. So we don't have to pay attention to things to have our feature detectors respond to them. But when we focus our attention, it's at that point in time that we bother to integrate those features together into something we can then recognize. So focusing our attention on something, one of the purposes that may serve is to basically give us the cognitive resources to integrate that feature information into something meaningful so that we can interpret it. And so as we look at things in the world, we have feature detectors that are responding to its location relative to us, responding to how far away it is, how it's moving, what's the direction, what's the color of the thing, what's the shape of the thing. We have feature detectors responding to all that. And when we attend to the object, we take in all of this feature information and integrate it into a single perceptual experience that gives us the sense of seeing the ball roll across the table. And there's other things happening that we are sensitive to in our world at that point in time, but our focused, overt attention is giving us the cognitive resources to pull those all together. And you're like, well, maybe. Seems kind of elaborate. Well, we do know. We have some interesting data that suggests people really do break the world up into features first. Tasks that Treisman and some of her colleagues have done show that if you have people look at scenes like this sometimes, and you ask them to focus on particular parts of this, look at the numbers, look at the shapes, things like that, ask them to focus on different parts, you'll find that when they make mistakes, what they do, if they haven't been focusing on something in particular, they're taking in, so you have them look at the numbers, and then you ask them later what kind of shapes were on the page. And they will have the features right, but they won't combine them correctly because they weren't focusing on them. So for example, they're more likely to make a mistake and report that they saw a green triangle, or a green open triangle, or a green solid triangle. Now, what they're doing is they're combining the open triangle with the green of this circle. Right? So the mistakes they make from lack of attention include the right features, but not the right combinations of features, suggesting that they took in the feature information,